Imagine walking into a therapist's office. You're seeking help for acute anxiety. Yeah, maybe you just want some coping mechanisms to, get through a tough season at work.
Exactly. But after a few sessions, you leave with a diagnosis for a severe personality disorder.
Wow.
Right. And it's not because your actual mental health aligns with that clinical pathology. It's simply because the cultural style in which you communicate is, well, maybe it's a bit louder or more expressive or just more direct.
And the therapist fundamentally misinterprets that.
Exactly. They completely misread it. According to the sources we're unpacking today, this isn't some rare anomaly. It's an everyday occurrence.
It happens constantly. And I mean, it is absolutely devastating. We see people's actions, their struggles, and we evaluate them based entirely on our own culturally conditioned script.
Yeah.
And when a professional does this, they completely ignore the complex social, cultural, and political landscape that the person sitting right across from them is actually navigating every single day.
Which is incredibly dangerous. It is. The consequences of that ignorance are just profound. I mean, it leads to misdiagnoses, shattered trust, and really just systemic harm.
And that is the exact problem we are tackling right now. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today's mission is to unpack the incredibly complex, sometimes intensely uncomfortable, but absolutely vital world of multicultural counseling competencies.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We are exploring how mental health professionals, and frankly, every single one of us in our daily interactions, navigate this intricate web of human identity and biases and systemic inequities just to truly understand one another.
Yeah, and to do this properly, we are pulling from a really robust stack of sources today.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We're looking at extensive excerpts from the foundational textbook Counseling the Culturally Diverse by Daryl Wing-Sue and his colleagues,
Right.
alongside the Handbook of Multicultural Counseling Competencies and the Palgrave Handbook of Intersectionality and Public Policy.
So a lot of really heavy-hitting material. And our goal for you, listening right now, is to move beyond the completely flawed, outdated idea of colorblindness.
Oh, absolutely. That idea just doesn't work.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
We want to equip you with the frameworks of intersectionality, cultural competence, and cultural humility.
Right.
I mean, I like to think of it this way. Trying to understand human behavior without looking at culture and intersecting identities, it's like trying to review a movie by only watching the shadow it casts on the wall.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You're missing all the color, the context, the dialogue. You're just seeing this vague, distorted shape.
You really are. But to even begin that journey, to look at the actual movie, we have to look at the immediate roadblock that pops up the second these topics are introduced.
The resistance.
Exactly. The sources spend a significant amount of time on this. They highlight that studying multiculturalism inevitably triggers powerful, often overwhelming emotional resistance.
It's never easy.
No, and that resistance manifests in vastly different ways depending on a person's social standing.
Right. Because when people are confronted with the realities of systemic oppression or prejudice or, their own potential complicity in those systems, it's not just some intellectual debate.
Not at all. It triggers a highly visceral emotional response.
Yeah.
The textbook Counseling the Culturally Diverse has been used in academic settings for decades,
Yeah.
right? And the authors have collected thousands of raw reactions from students who read it.
And the spectrum of those reactions is just wild.
Oh, yeah.
It really reveals the psychological mechanics of how we protect our worldviews.
It does. It's fascinating.
Let's actually look at a few of these specific reactions from the sources because they're incredibly telling.
Sure.
So we have this white female student who reacted to the textbook with this intense, palpable anger. Like, she wrote to the authors calling them hate mongers. Yeah, hate mongers and racists of a different color. She accused them of trying to weaken national unity and essentially told them that if they don't like it in this country, they should just pack up and leave.
Which is, I mean, it's a massive reaction. And the psychological mechanism at play there is cognitive dissonance functioning at its absolute peak.
Right, because her reality is being challenged.
Exactly. This student likely holds a very core belief that she is a good, fair person living in a fundamentally just society.
Sure, most people want to believe that.
Right. So when the text introduces data showing that society is actually structurally unequal and that she might unconsciously harbor biases, that information directly threatens her core identity.
So she attacks the source.
Exactly. The brain's immediate defense mechanism is to attack the source of the dissonant information. If the authors are just, hate mongers, well, then she doesn't have to engage with their data at all.
It completely lets her off the hook.
Yes.
And I see that exact same mechanism in the second reaction. This one is from a white male student. He felt personally offended too, but his defense took a slightly different route.
Oh, how so?
Well, he argued that the United States isn't the only perpetrator of prejudice. He said that minority groups are equally racist.
Ah, the classic deflection.
Right. And he asked why the authors take pleasure in attacking white people when white people have, in his words, done so much to help you people.
Oh, man. The phrase "you people" is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really is. It's so divisive.
It immediately creates this us versus them dichotomy, right? His reaction shifts the entire focus from systemic power dynamics to just individual grievances.
Yeah, because if everyone is racist, then no one is structurally responsible.
Exactly. By arguing that everyone is racist, he is attempting to completely neutralize the concept of systemic power. If prejudice is just this universal human flaw, then no single group holds institutional responsibility. It's a highly effective way for the brain to alleviate the guilt and anxiety that naturally arises from confronting privilege.
So that's the resistance from the dominant group.
Yes.
But then you compare those two reactions to the other side of the spectrum.
Right, the marginalized students.
Yeah. So a Latina student writes in about the exact same textbook, the same words on the page, and she says it gave her a voice.
What a contrast.
Totally. She stated that the text validated her life experiences, reaffirmed how she sees the world, and most poignantly, she literally wrote, "It felt good to know I am not crazy."
Man, that phrase, "I am not crazy," that is arguably the most profound takeaway from all of these student responses.
It gave me chills reading it.
I mean, for marginalized students, discussing systemic oppression in an academic setting, it's deeply validating because their lived realities are finally being named by an authority.
Right.
This student has likely spent her entire life experiencing daily microaggressions, subtle invalidations, structural barriers, and the dominant culture has probably told her she is too sensitive or misreading the situation.
Constantly gaslighting her.
Yes, essentially. So when an authoritative textbook outlines the exact sociological phenomena she experiences every day, it just removes the burden of self-doubt.
And then we have the reaction of an African-American male student.
Oh, this one is interesting.
Yeah, he said the book made him feel liberated because it didn't tiptoe around the subject of race. But he also added that he thoroughly enjoyed seeing his white classmates squirm in their seats.
Right.
He said he had absolutely no sympathy for them and that it was about time they learned to listen, which, is a very strong reaction.
It is. And the authors of the text handle this reaction with a lot of nuance, which I appreciate.
Yeah, how do they break that down?
Well, they caution against taking delight in the discomfort of others. They point out that it can become a massive barrier to building mutual respect or a true therapeutic alliance later on.
Right. The goal is connection, not punishment.
Exactly. The goal of multicultural training is to dismantle ethnocentrism, not to inflict emotional retribution. But, and this is key, they also completely validate the sheer weight of the unexpressed frustration that marginalized individuals carry.
Yeah, it's a release valve.
That's exactly what it is. His reaction is a release valve for decades of historical and personal invalidation.
So we have the literal same words on the page producing these violently different emotional realities.
A completely different
For
reality.
marginalized students, it's pure validation. But for the majority group members, it's this massive threat to their self-image. It leads to cognitive resistance, which is basically denial.
Yep.
Emotional resistance, which is that guilt and defensive anger.
Yeah.
And behavioral resistance, which often manifests as
Yeah.
helplessness, right? Like the idea that the problem is too big, so I can't do anything about it.
Which is such a convenient excuse for inaction.
It really is.
But the sources do share this really remarkable narrative about actually overcoming this exact resistance.
Oh, Dr. Kizelica, right?
Yes, Dr. Mark Kizelica. He's a white psychologist who read an early edition of this very textbook back in the 1980s. And he openly admits that his initial reaction was one of great anger and disgust.
He didn't hold back.
No, he felt personally blamed for historical atrocities. He resented the authors because he considered himself a culturally sensitive person, right? And he felt unjustly under attack.
I mean, reading his account, it's fascinating how transparent he is. He says he literally wanted to throw the book across the room.
But he didn't.
He didn't. He forced himself to sit with that intense, burning discomfort. He engaged in deep self-reflection and realized that his anger was actually just a mask for fear. He
Yes.
was terrified of being labeled a racist.
Hmm.
He was terrified of looking in the mirror and realizing he had unconsciously bought into the stereotypes of his environment.
And that realization is the critical pivot. I mean, he eventually admitted to himself that, he had laughed at racist jokes in the past, he had used slurs in his youth,
Yeah.
and he was unavoidably a product of a culture steeped in racial prejudice.
But admitting that didn't destroy him.
No, that admission wasn't the end of his career. It was the actual beginning of his true competence. Recognizing his own unconscious racial conditioning was the necessary first step to developing genuine, unclouded empathy for his diverse clients.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I completely understand why that self-reflection is necessary. But I have to ask a difficult question here on behalf of you, the listener.
Go for it.
If recognizing these group dynamics and biases causes so much guilt, defensive anger, and societal friction, wouldn't it be more productive for everyone, especially in a clinical setting, to just focus on our shared humanity?
Ah,
I mean, if a clinician is seeing 8 different clients a day from 8 totally different cultural backgrounds, isn't focusing on the universal human experience just a necessary triage tactic? Like, how is anyone supposed to cognitively hold all these group identities without burning out?
it is an incredibly common question, and it really highlights a major philosophical tension in the entire field. So, to address the cognitive load aspect first,
Hmm.
no therapist can know everything about every culture. It's just impossible.
Okay.
But the alternative, defaulting to this idea that we are all the same, is actually actively dangerous.
Really dangerous.
Yes. When a therapist or a policymaker assumes a universal colorblind human experience, they aren't actually finding a neutral middle ground.
What are they doing then?
They are almost always defaulting to the norms of the dominant culture and projecting those norms onto the client.
Ah, so they think they're being egalitarian and fair, but they are actually just erasing the specific lived realities of marginalized people.
Precisely. If we pretend we are all exactly the same, we become completely blind to the very real structural differences in how we are treated by society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this mindset is actually the foundation of what the traditional mental health field historically called good counseling.
Right, the idea that good counseling is just good counseling.
Exactly. The old adage was that clinical skills are universally applicable. Like, if you are a good therapist, you can treat anyone, anywhere, because human psychology is universal.
And the sources completely dismantle that idea.
They tear it apart.
They argue that traditional Western therapy is not a universal, objective science at all. It is a deeply culture-bound practice built entirely on Western European values.
Just think about the underlying assumptions of traditional therapy. It values rugged individualism above almost everything else.
Right. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes. The goal is often to help the client become this independent, self-actualized entity, completely separate from their family or community expectations.
And it relies so heavily on talking.
Yes. It values verbal and emotional expressiveness. The whole mechanism of healing is talking it out. It values scientific empiricism, relying on this very linear, rational, cause and effect thinking.
And it all happens in a very specific setting.
Right. It forces all of this into a strict 50-minute weekly office-bound schedule.
So, okay, if you come from a collectivistic culture where your identity is completely intertwined with your family,
Yes.
or a culture that views discussing personal problems outside the home as deeply shameful,
Exactly.
or even a culture that relies on holistic spiritual healing rather than this linear clinical analysis, traditional therapy is going to feel incredibly alienating.
It's not just alienating, it can be actively harmful. There is a case study in the sources that illustrates the tragic fallout of this culture-bound approach perfectly.
Gabriella's case.
Yes.
Gabriella, she's a 29-year-old Latina client. She was born in Brazil, immigrated to the U.S. at age 10, and she seeks out a white counselor, Dr. D, because she's experiencing severe panic attacks.
Right, and she has a very specific cultural context for these attacks.
She does. She contextualizes these attacks culturally. She refers to them as attics, noting that her mother used to suffer from similar episodes back in Brazil.
I'm looking at Dr. D's responses in the source text, and I mean, it's genuinely frustrating to read.
It's hard to get through. Gabriella explains that her parents are deeply upset because she is planning to move in with her white boyfriend. Her parents are terrified that the boyfriend just views her as a Latina fetish, right? That he has no real commitment to her.
Which is a very valid, culturally specific fear.
Absolutely. So Gabriella is caught in this agonizing space between her family's cultural expectations, the reality of racial stereotyping, and her current relationship. It is triggering these massive attacks.
And how does Dr. D respond?
He responds by saying, and I quote, "I think it's more important what you think and want for yourself, not what your parents would like you to do. Be your own person."
Ugh, be your own person.
Right.
That is the rugged Western individualism we just talked about, completely ignoring the collectivistic reality of Gabriella's family structure. He genuinely thinks he's empowering her.
He thinks he's giving her permission to self-actualize.
But what he is actually doing is locating the problem entirely inside the client.
Right. And when she tries to explain that she feels misunderstood as a Latina woman dealing with these really specific stereotypes, Dr. D doubles down.
He makes it work.
Cultural differences are important, but it's more important to recognize that we are all human beings. When it comes right down to it, we are all the same under the skin.
And there it is. That is the colorblind approach in action. And it is, frankly, a form of clinical victim blaming.
Wow, victim blaming.
Yes. He is telling Gabriella that the external systemic stressors, the threat of fetishization, the complex immigration dynamics of her family, that they don't actually matter. If she just asserts her individualism, the anxiety will just vanish. He completely invalidates her reality.
I mean, it's like bringing a heavy-duty diesel truck to a mechanic who has only ever worked on electric sedans.
That's exactly what it's like.
Right. The truck is sputtering, it needs a specific type of fuel, it operates on combustion, and the mechanic just pops the hood, ignores the entire engine block, and says, "Hey, an engine is an engine. We are all the same under the hood. Just plug it into the wall."
It's not just unhelpful, it's going to cause catastrophic damage to the vehicle.
Yeah.
And in Gabriella's case, it destroys the therapeutic alliance. She shuts down completely. She never goes back.
So if traditional therapy fails Gabriella by only seeing her humanity and totally ignoring her culture, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Like, how do we map out a person's identity without overcorrecting and just putting them in a rigid box?
That's where Daryl Wing Sue's tripartite framework of identity comes in. It solves this exact clinical blind spot.
This framework is brilliant in its simplicity. I love it.
Yeah, break it down for us.
So picture 3 concentric circles, like a bullseye.
Okay.
The innermost circle is the individual level. This represents our unique genetics and our highly specific personal experiences. It's the part of us that is like absolutely no one else.
Right. And then the outermost circle is the universal level. This encompasses our shared human experiences, our biological need for food and shelter, our mortality, our fundamental ability to feel joy and sorrow. It's the part of us that is like everyone else.
And then there is the middle circle, the group level. This includes our race, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, religion, disability.
Yeah.
The list goes on.
Yeah.
It's the part of us that is like some others. And the sources point out that Western psychology has historically obsessed over the individual and universal levels while actively ignoring this group level.
And the reason for that omission is highly political.
Really?
Political.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Acknowledging the group level forces professionals to acknowledge sociopolitical realities, historical oppression, unearned privilege, systemic racism, patriarchy.
Things people don't want to talk about.
Exactly. It is much safer and much more comfortable for the dominant culture to say, you are a unique individual and part of the human family, than to look a client in the eye and say, your psychological distress is fundamentally shaped by being a marginalized person in a society that actively discriminates against you. Wow, yeah. The text uses an East Asian proverb to capture this 3-tiered reality so beautifully. It says, all individuals, in many respects, are like no other individuals, like some individuals, and like all other individuals.
That sums it up perfectly. And Dr. D completely ignored Gabriella's group-level identity. He treated her purely on the individual and universal levels, forcing her to either assimilate to his Western norms or be labeled as clinically resistant.
So to address my earlier question about cognitive load, how do you use this framework without burning out?
The key is understanding that it is a fluid map, right? It's not a rigid script. The boundaries between these circles are highly permeable, and their salience shifts constantly depending on the environment.
So it's constantly moving.
Yes. A client might emphasize their unique individual trauma in one breath, and then their shared human struggle with grief in the next. The therapist's job isn't to hold every single identity trait in their active memory at all times.
Because you can't.
Right, you can't.
Yeah.
The job is to remain open and agile enough to recognize which level the client is speaking from at any given moment.
And crucially, no one belongs to just one group in that middle circle.
Yeah.
You aren't just your race or just your gender. Which brings us to a concept coined in 1989 that completely revolutionized this entire field.
Intersectionality.
Intersectionality,
Yeah.
coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw and later expanded upon by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins with her concept of the matrix of domination.
It's foundational.
It really is. It posits that social categories do not operate independently. Race, class, gender, ability, they are interlocking and simultaneous.
Right.
I used to hear people describe intersectionality like baking a cake. You can't separate the flour from the sugar once it's baked.
Sure.
But after reading these sources, I think a much better analogy is a mixing board in a music studio.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you don't just have one master volume slider for a person's life. You have sliders for race, socioeconomic status, gender, disability, religion.
Yeah.
If you push the marginalized race slider up and the poverty slider up simultaneously, the sound that comes out of the speakers isn't just louder. The frequencies interact to create an entirely different, physically distorted acoustic reality.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The sliders interact to create unique frequencies of experience. Patricia Hill Collins' matrix of domination helps us understand that these sliders aren't just personal descriptors.
Right.
They are hardwired into massive interlocking systems of power and oppression in society. When policymakers or therapists fail to use an intersectional lens, they fail their constituents because they treat groups as monolithic.
To combat this, the sources introduce a diagnostic tool called the Addressing Framework, developed by Pamela Hayes. It's an acronym designed to help professionals actually map out these intersecting identities.
It's super practical. A is for age and generational influences.
D is for developmental or acquired disabilities.
R is for religion and spiritual orientation.
E is for ethnicity.
S is for socioeconomic status.
The second S is for sexual orientation.
I is for indigenous heritage.
N is for national origin.
And G is for gender.
Okay, let's actually apply this instead of just listing the letters. Let's look at religion and socioeconomic status.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine a policymaker trying to design community outreach for a working-class Muslim neighborhood. Yeah. If they only look at the religion slider, they might design a program that provides halal food banks.
Which is helpful, sure.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
But if they ignore the socioeconomic status slider, they might put those food banks in areas that require a car to access.
Completely missing their reality.
Right. They miss the fact that the working-class reality of this specific neighborhood relies heavily on public transit. The intersection of being Muslim and working class creates a specific need that neither label alone can fully address.
The sources provide a brilliant, real-world example of this intersectional approach in action. It's the Asian Immigrant Women Advocates, or AIWA, based in California.
Oh yeah, their work is incredible.
It really is. If AIWA had operated without an intersectional lens, they might have just fought for women's rights broadly, or immigrant rights broadly.
But if they did that, they would likely miss the specific acute needs of their actual constituents.
Exactly. AIWA recognized that their constituents, specifically Asian immigrant women working in the garment industry, faced a unique, interlocking set of challenges.
Right.
Historically, garment workers have been highly exploited, but these women were facing a compounded vulnerability. They were marginalized by gender, by race, by their immigrant status, and by their economic class.
So many sliders turned up.
Yes. So AIWA didn't just ask for better wages in a vacuum. They combined the fight for workplace protections with the provision of English language classes.
Because they understood that for these specific women, the lack of language access was the mechanism locking them into economic exploitation.
Right. You can't fight for your labor rights if you literally cannot read the labor laws or communicate with the regulatory agency.
It's impossible.
By addressing the intersection, AIWA was helping these women achieve what scholar Tiffany Manuel refers to as the good life. That's the capacity to envision and realize well-being on their own culturally relevant terms.
But when professionals fail to use this intersectional lens, the human brain gets overwhelmed by the complexity. And to manage that cognitive load, the brain relies on mental shortcuts.
Which is human nature,
But in a clinical setting, those shortcuts manifest as dangerous biases and stereotypes.
they absolutely do.
Let's dig into how those stereotypes actually function.
Yeah.
The sources define stereotypes as cognitive tools for categorization and generalization.
Right.
They come in two forms. Descriptive stereotypes, which are beliefs about how people in a certain group supposedly behave, and prescriptive stereotypes, which are these insidious beliefs about how people in a certain group should behave.
And when a therapist brings these cognitive shortcuts into a session, it results in massive clinical errors. The two most prominent are attribution error and confirmatory strategy.
Walk us through those.
Sure. Attribution error occurs when a therapist places an undue emphasis on internal traits to explain a client's problem rather than looking at systemic or environmental issues.
Give me an example.
If a client is living in poverty, dealing with neighborhood violence and systemic racism, and the therapist diagnoses them with a lack of motivation or a depressive disorder without acknowledging the crushing weight of their environment, that is an attribution error.
They're blaming the individual for a systemic failure.
Exactly. And then there's confirmatory strategy.
Okay, tell me if this translates. It's like a building inspector who has already decided a house is falling apart before they even arrive at the property.
Okay, go on.
So they walk in, they only take photos of the peeling wallpaper and the leaky faucet, and they completely ignore the brand new, mathematically perfect steel foundation.
Yeah.
They only gather evidence that confirms the bias they walked in with.
That captures the mechanism perfectly. The therapist forms a hypothesis based on a stereotype and then only listens for clinical data that supports that hypothesis, discarding everything else.
It's wild.
The sources provide two chilling examples of this. In one clinical study, therapists were given identical intake reports for a male client. The behavioral data, the symptoms, the history, everything was exactly the same.
Word for word.
Word for word. The only variable was that in some reports, the client was identified as heterosexual and in others as bisexual.
And the therapists who read the report identifying the client as bisexual were significantly more likely to diagnose him with an emotional disturbance.
The clinical data didn't change a single comma, but the therapist's confirmatory strategy kicked in. They were operating on the societal stereotype that bisexual men are inherently confused, conflicted, or unstable.
Right?
So they read emotional disturbance into the exact same behavioral data that they viewed as perfectly normal for the heterosexual client.
Wow. If you're listening to this and you manage a team at work, just think about your last round of performance reviews. Did you only look for mistakes that confirmed your initial gut feeling about an employee?
Ouch. Yeah.
Did you ignore their successes because they didn't fit the narrative you had already built? That is confirmatory strategy in action. And it ruins careers, just like it ruins therapeutic alliances.
It really does. And the second example in the text is just as infuriating.
What was that one?
It involves a Black woman who is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder.
And why was she diagnosed with that?
Because her culturally influenced communication style is loud, emotionally expressive, and confrontational.
Oh my God.
Yes. The therapist pathologizes her cultural expression simply because it doesn't fit the quiet, submissive, emotionally restrained norm of white middle-class communication.
These aren't just isolated mistakes. These are manifestations of microaggressions in therapy. Microaggressions are the everyday slights, put-downs, and invalidations directed at marginalized groups.
Yeah.
When a therapist pathologizes a cultural value, they are committing a clinical microaggression that destroys trust instantly.
Instantly. And it is vital to understand that these biases and microaggressions are not strictly a white therapist versus minority client issue.
Right.
The matrix of domination affects everyone. We all breathe the same societal air, which means we all inherit these biases. This leads us into one of the most complex and least discussed areas in multicultural training.
The dynamics between marginalized groups themselves.
Yes. The sources refer to this as the interethnic and interracial matrix.
Because multicultural training usually just focuses on this simple binary, right? White dominant culture versus people of color.
Exactly. But marginalized group members are not immune to inheriting the biases of the dominant society.
The sources cite a study by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, the NCCJ, that highlights this so painfully. The study showed that over 40% of African Americans and Hispanics hold the stereotype that Asian Americans are unscrupulous or devious in business.
It's heartbreaking.
But where does a stereotype like that come from between two groups that both experience systemic racism?
It is a direct byproduct of the harmful model minority myth.
The idea that Asian Americans are just naturally successful.
Right. The dominant culture pushes this narrative that Asian Americans are the good, successful, hardworking minority. And this myth serves two highly destructive purposes. First, it completely ignores the vast economic disparities and real struggles within diverse Asian American communities.
Because it's not a monolith.
Exactly. And second, it intentionally drives a wedge between Asian Americans and other groups of color. It breeds resentment and suspicion. pitting marginalized groups against each other in a toxic competition for societal approval.
The text calls out the destructive nature of the who's more oppressed game. It divides groups and prevents any sort of meaningful coalition building.
And when we bring this interethnic matrix into the therapy room, counselors of color face incredibly unique challenges that white counselors simply do not.
Like what?
Well, for example, when a counselor of color works with a white client, they are sometimes treated as an omniscient super-minority expert.
Oh, wow.
The white client might unconsciously expect the therapist to absolve their white guilt or expect them to speak as a representative for their entire race.
Or the therapist has to deal with clients who overtly express views that are harmful to the therapist's own identity.
Yes, that too.
There is a deeply complex example in the text regarding a Latino male therapist. He talks about struggling to maintain clinical empathy for his clients, who are mostly white heterosexual males, who are coming into therapy expressing deep anxiety over the hashtag #MeToo movement, worrying if they are guilty of past harassment.
Right. And we must note here, the sources are not taking a political stance on the hashtag #MeToo movement itself, and neither are we.
No, of course not.
What the text is highlighting objectively is the incredibly complex countertransference created by these specific power dynamics.
Wait, before we move on, what exactly is complex countertransference in this context? Is that just a therapist's personal baggage bleeding into the session?
That's a great question. So, in traditional psychoanalysis, transference is when a client projects their feelings about someone else, like a parent, onto the therapist.
Okay, makes sense.
Countertransference is the reverse, when the therapist projects their own unresolved personal issues onto the client. But complex countertransference in a multicultural setting is specifically about power dynamics. It's when a marginalized therapist is tasked with providing empathetic, unbiased care to individuals who represent the dominant power structure, specifically regarding an issue of power and gender.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. The therapist has to navigate their own lived experience of marginalization while holding space for the anxiety of the privileged client. It requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness and emotional regulation to navigate that without letting personal animosity derail the therapy entirely.
That completely shatters the illusion that putting any two people of color or any two marginalized people in a room automatically results in cultural understanding.
It's not magic.
No. Everyone has to do the work. Just because you experience one type of oppression doesn't mean you automatically understand someone else's.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core question of clinical practice. How does a therapist, regardless of their background, actually prove to a client that they have done the work? How do they build that bridge across the cultural divide?
Well, research shows it comes down to two primary factors: credibility and attractiveness.
Let's define those, because attractiveness in a clinical setting definitely does not mean physical appearance.
Right. Credibility is a combination of expertness and trustworthiness. Expertness is the tangible stuff. Your training, your degrees, your behavioral evidence of proficiency.
Your resume, basically.
Yeah. But trustworthiness is the tricky part. It is incredibly hard to establish trustworthiness with culturally diverse clients who, quite accurately, view the mental health system as an instrument of oppression.
And they have every right to view it that way.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Why should a black client immediately trust an agent of a medical system that has a documented history of systemic abuse, like the Tuskegee experiments, or a history of weaponizing schizophrenia diagnoses against civil rights activists?
They shouldn't. The skepticism is a completely rational safety mechanism.
And attractiveness refers to the client's perception that the counselor is similar to them or shares their worldview. It's the feeling of, this person gets me, we speak the same language, we value the same things.
So, to build both trustworthiness and attractiveness, therapists must adapt their relational styles. This is where evidence-based practice, or EBP, intersects with multiculturalism.
How so?
Well, EBP suggests that different groups may have different relational preferences based on their cultural paradigms, and a culturally competent therapist must be agile enough to adapt.
The sources offer some generalizations here, emphasizing strongly that these must be tested individually.
Very important point.
Yeah. For example, they note that African American clients may initially value social interaction and building a personal rapport over immediate clinical problem solving.
And if we look at the why behind that, it ties directly back to what we just discussed about systemic trust. Because the institutional trust is low, the therapist must establish interpersonal trustworthiness before clinical vulnerability can occur.
They have to prove they're a safe human being before they can be a safe clinician.
Exactly. The sources also note that Asian American clients might initially prefer a more structured, directive, problem-solving approach.
Why is that?
This often traces back to cultural paradigms that deeply respect authority and hierarchy, alongside a potential cultural stigma against dwelling on emotional distress. If a client views the therapist as an authoritative expert, they expect actionable guidance and structure, not just open-ended emotional exploration.
But this feels like a tightrope walk to me. We just spent a significant amount of time talking about the dangers of stereotyping and confirmatory strategy.
True.
So how does a professional adjust their behavior based on a client's race or culture without falling right back into prescriptive stereotyping? If I assume an Asian American client wants a highly structured session just because they're Asian American, aren't they doing exactly what we said not to do?
That's the tightrope. And the difference lies entirely in whether you are using cultural knowledge as a rigid box or as a flexible hypothesis.
Flexible hypothesis, okay.
The culturally competent therapist holds that knowledge very lightly. They might start with a structured approach for that client because statistical data suggests it might be well received, but they are constantly monitoring the client's reactions.
Like reading the room.
Yes. Are they responding positively? Is the therapeutic alliance building? If the client seems resistant to the structure, the therapist immediately discards the hypothesis and adapts. They don't force the client into the cultural box. They use the cultural knowledge as a starting point for exploration.
Which brings us to our final major concept and really the ultimate goal of everything we've talked about today, the evolution from cultural competence to cultural humility.
This is such a vital shift. For a long time, the gold standard in the field was the Multicultural Counseling Competencies Model, the MCC.
What did that entail?
It demanded 3 core things from a therapist: awareness of one's own biases and assumptions, knowledge of the client's worldview, and skills to use culturally appropriate intervention strategies.
And the field later expanded this into the MSJCC, the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies. This model specifically maps out quadrants of power and privilege.
Right.
Can you break down what those quadrants actually look like in a session? I mean, how does that work practically?
The MSJCC asks the therapist to explicitly analyze the power dynamics in the room. So there are 4 main dyads, or quadrants.
Okay.
You could have a privileged counselor working with an oppressed client, which is the most commonly discussed dynamic.
Or white counselor or minority client.
Right. But you could also have an oppressed counselor working with a privileged client, as we saw with the Latino therapist and his white male clients.
That's it.
You could have a privileged counselor working with a privileged client where both might share blind spots regarding social justice.
Oh, interesting.
Or you could have an oppressed counselor working with an oppressed client, which requires navigating that complex interethnic matrix we discussed earlier. The MSJCC demands that the therapist actively acknowledge which quadrant they are operating in at all times.
It's a fantastic analytical tool. But the sources point out that even this level of competence has a fatal flaw.
What's the flaw?
Competence implies an endpoint. It implies you took a seminar, you read the textbook, you passed a test, and now you are officially competent in working with Latino clients or LGBTQ clients.
It's treated like a checkbox.
Exactly. It was framed historically as a way of doing.
And the shift now is toward cultural humility, which is fundamentally a way of being.
I love that distinction.
Cultural humility requires maintaining an open, genuinely respectful, and endlessly inquisitive stance. It means accepting that you will never know everything about another culture, and therefore, you must recognize the client as the ultimate, undisputed expert on their own cultural journey.
You're not the omniscient doctor anymore.
No, you are a collaborative partner navigating the map together.
Competence sounds like a certificate you frame on your wall and forget about. Humility sounds like a muscle you have to stretch and tear and rebuild every single day.
And the clinical data firmly supports this shift. Research highlighted in the sources shows that when clients perceive their therapists as culturally humble, the frequency of microaggressions in the session actually drops significantly.
That makes sense.
But even more importantly, if a microaggression does occur because therapists are human and blind spots are inevitable, the therapeutic alliance is much easier to repair.
Why is it easier to repair? Does the humility just act as a buffer?
It changes the reaction protocol. A culturally humble therapist doesn't react defensively when called out.
Mm.
When a client points out a blind spot or a microaggression, a culturally competent but defensive therapist might say, "You're misinterpreting me. I didn't mean it that way," which just invalidates the client all over again.
Oh, yeah, the classic, "I'm sorry you felt that
Yeah,
way."
exactly. But a culturally humble therapist says, "Thank you for bringing that up. Tell me more about how that impacted you. I am here to learn." That non-defensive response validates the client's reality and immediately repairs the trust.
Let's take a breath and look back at the massive ground we've covered today.
We really went deep.
We did. We started by looking at the intense emotional resistance, the cognitive dissonance, the anger, the guilt that arises when we are forced to confront our own biases, and the myth of a colorblind society.
We examined how traditional therapy's assumption that we are all the same actually enforces Western values of rugged individualism and erases cultural realities, like we saw with the tragic mismanagement of Gabriella's attacks.
We mapped out the tripartite framework, understanding that we are simultaneously unique individuals, members of specific societal groups, and part of the universal human family.
And we layered on the mixing board of intersectionality, realizing that race, class, gender, and ability are inextricably linked to interlocking systems of power. And we saw how organizations like AIWA use that framework to achieve real-world equity.
We navigated the dangerous clinical shortcuts of attribution error and confirmatory strategy, and we pulled back the curtain on the complex biases and countertransference that exist between marginalized groups themselves.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate destination, the shift from the rigid, endpoint-driven idea of cultural competence to the lifelong, daily muscle stretch of cultural humility.
The most important takeaway for you, listening right now, is that you do not have to be a clinical therapist with a 50-minute hour to apply these frameworks.
Absolutely not.
Whether you are crafting public policy in a government office, managing a diverse team at a tech startup, or just trying to be a better neighbor. Understanding your own intersecting identities and approaching others with genuine cultural humility is the master key to meaningful human connection.
It fundamentally changes how you listen, how you ask questions, and how you show up in the world.
But I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, I'm curious.
We've talked so much today about how identity is fluid and contextual, how intersectionality proves that our social categories are constantly shifting and combining.
Right.
So, if that is true, what will cultural competence look like 50 years from now? As our society becomes increasingly hybridized, will the categories we currently use to define ourselves, our rigid checkboxes for race, gender, and class, even exist in the same way? Or will we have evolved an entirely new vocabulary for human difference?
It is a fascinating question. I mean, as static categories potentially dissolve into more complex hybrid identities, the specific knowledge aspect of competence might actually become obsolete.
Right.
The only constant, the only tool that will survive that evolution is the underlying humility.
And that is where the work begins. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Thank you for being willing to lean into the discomfort, to examine the emotional roadblocks, and to question your own worldview. Keep stretching that humility muscle. And remember, don't try to understand the human story by just staring at the shadows on the wall.
Yeah.
Turn around, look at the complex systems casting those shadows, and try to see the whole picture in all its messy, beautiful context. See you next time.